Well, many thanks to Mark for facilitating our day today. Really grateful. Thanks to RTPI for their partnership that they've offered us through this whole process, and to Bevan Britton and Peel as well for supporting the conference. And I'm delighted, thank you all for giving such a sort of endorsement right at the beginning of the conference for the fact that we've come together today to think about what a Great North Plan might look like. Just by way of background, we, IPPR North, wrote a report back in 2012 called Northern Prosperity is National Prosperity. And in that report, we asked the question, or rather, we made the assertion that we think that, like many other developed nations, particularly in Europe, we need some kind of spatial plan for the north of England. And we've continued ever since then to say that this is something that we should consider in some more detail. We worked with Peel last year and some of the universities on a Framing the Futures conference, and we published as well something which we called the Great North Plan, which was actually a competition for great ideas about the future of the north of England in 2030 and 2050, and you can find all these publications on our website, and that was kind of more of a visionary document about what the north might be like. And as I say, now we've formed this partnership with the RTPI, and we've carried out 11 roundtables last year to ask the question, do we actually need a Great North Plan? We also issued a call for evidence, and we're very grateful to all of those of you here who submitted evidence to that. And now today we're convening this Northern Summit. All of these things, as Mark has said, are part of a process to start for ourselves, if you like, to own this idea of a Northern Powerhouse and to articulate, we think in more holistic terms, what the Northern economy might be like into the future. And I do want to mention, though, that the Northern Powerhouse agenda that has been driven by the Chancellor and by government more generally is fundamentally important to this. We're not setting the Great North Plan up against the Northern Powerhouse. It's about building on that Northern Powerhouse. And also to mention that there's huge work going on through the Transport for the North body in the development of a Northern Transport strategy that is also fundamental to this process. But what we have found through the discussions and through the roundtables is that there is appetite for thinking about the north of England in a more holistic way. And so when we asked people at the round tables whether or not they thought we needed a Great North Plan, the answer was a resounding yes. And once again, we've seen today those of you around these tables saying, actually, yes, there is something that we need to look at, which, if I might put it in these terms, goes beyond transport. The transport is fundamental, but it goes beyond that. Secondly, it goes beyond competitive cities. A lot of the agenda has been focused very much on the big cities, and again, that's fundamentally important. We'll come back to this. The cities are absolutely the primary drivers of economic growth in the north of England and mustn't be overlooked. But there are lots of towns and rural areas and so on that have a symbiotic relationship with those cities, and we need something which actually accounts for their role in the northern economy as well. And also, if I might be a little bit challenging, just to say that we need to go beyond backroom deals. Part of the popularity of conferences like this is the fact that there are many businesses, the general public, there are academics, there are others who feel they've got a lot to contribute to the Northern Powerhouse agenda, but too often up till now it's been perceived to be deals between government officials and ministers and city leaders. Very, very important deals and very hard won, don't misunderstand me, but at the same time we need to open the process out and make it a bit more inclusive. So I think that's been some of the energy that's been behind the Great North Plan process. So we asked you, what do you think the Great North Plan should look like? And Mark, forgive me for slightly contradicting you, but this, what I'm presenting here this morning, is not Ed Cox's ideas or IPPR North's ideas or indeed RTPI's ideas. These are the ideas that you fed back to us through the round tables that we have now tried to summarise through the call for evidence. We've tried to summarise and to set out now in this presentation the things that you told us you thought a Great North Plan should and shouldn't be. So what I'm going to work through now are if you like, the collation of what we've heard already, and what you're going to do then later on is to take that and debate it some more and thrash it out in a bit more detail, and hopefully through our roundtables, through the interactive voting that we're going to do throughout the day, we will be able to discuss and take the Great North Plan another step forward. So let me start by setting out some of the key principles that seem to have emerged from the roundtables and from the call for evidence that we issued. What should this Great North Plan look like? Well, first of all, there was a real enthusiasm that it should be high level, it should be strategic, and it should be brief. What we don't want is another 10,000 pages of planning guidance. That's not what a Great North Plan should be. It should be high level, strategic, and brief. It needs to be ambitious. It needs to set out a long-term vision, but it also has to have a bit of grit, a short to medium-term action plan. I'm going to come back to some of these things. Thirdly, it needs to be evolutionary. It can't just be a plan which is done once and for all. It needs to be created and then developed and enhanced as time goes by. We recognise there are lots of plans already, but it needs to then build on those plans, and it needs to be responsive with ongoing challenges and changes. It needs to be collaborative. I think fundamentally we know that our planning processes have to bring together multiple stakeholders, and it needs to create something of a framework and a reference point for other more detailed plans. Perhaps those plans that are undertaken by combined authorities or indeed local authorities, it's not wanting to control or constrain them, but to create a framework in which that planning process can take place. So it needs to be inclusive. It needs to speak to all places across the north of England, but equally it needs to be asymmetrical. We're witnessing at the moment an asymmetrical devolution process, and I will be honest and say I've got concerns about what happens to all those Devo deals that have yet to be struck in places outside the big cities. But we recognise that different places will have different significance within the northern economy, and that's right, and we need to invest our energy and our resources in those places that have particular significance to driving growth and prosperity. So inclusive but asymmetrical. You told us a few things that you didn't think that the Great North Plan should be. It should not be statutory. Okay, that's not the role of a Great North Plan. It shouldn't be so comprehensive that it tries to deal with every single little issue, otherwise it won't be high level and strategic and brief. It shouldn't interfere with local plans. It shouldn't be too vanilla. It shouldn't look like every other plan that you might find at the regional or sub-regional, subnational level across Europe. And it should avoid being a name-checking exercise that every single place has to be named within a Great North Plan. So those were some of the things you said it shouldn't be. So those are the principles. A lot of people in the roundtables said, well, it all depends on the audience. So who should it be by? Who should create it? Who should it be for? That's the next discussion topic, if you like, that came out. We have found that we need to develop this Great North Plan from the bottom up. I've amusingly heard government officials talk about Northern Powerhouse, come to the North and talk about the Northern Powerhouse as by the North and for the North. Well, we think we should take ownership of that process, that it genuinely needs to be by the North and for the North, but as a voluntary, strategic collaboration involving a wide range of different stakeholders. Of course, local and combined authority leaders are key. Members of Parliament are important as well. Businesses and business groups, including the local enterprise partnerships, have got to have a significant role in developing this Great North Plan. I'm delighted that so many business people are here this morning. Universities have a critical role to play, and there are many other public bodies. I'm thinking particularly about the Environment Agency, for example, and their crucial role in developing a resilient economy. The general public and civil society are often those that at the moment feel squeezed out of debate. How can we make a Great North Plan process one which is even inclusive of the general public? Those are some of the challenges I think that we have in developing a process that is genuinely bottom up. But it's also got to speak to a wide audience as well. You told us that you thought that it needs to speak to central government. It needs to speak to corporate finance. And we hear a lot about the importance of foreign investment in driving the Northern Powerhouse. It needs to be able to do that as well. And then we recognise that it needs to speak to the EU and to other international institutions. So you might say, well, that's created by everyone for everyone. And I think that would be a critique of what we're trying to do here. But the way in which our call for evidence and the way in which our round tables sought to address that was essentially by talking about the Great North Plan as a series, a suite of different documents. So this is the kind of real crunch of what we are setting out today and what you told us when we had our round tables. And we called it the kind of 4 purposes of a Great North Plan, a suite of, if you like, interlinked documents, not just one single plan. The 4 things that we think you talked about are, first of all, establishing a vision. The plan needs to be something of a vision statement for the north of England with a small number of cross-cutting themes, which I'll come to in a moment. And these need to be readily understood by everybody. So one of the critiques of the Northern Powerhouse is that there's no real vision as to exactly what it might be and where it is. So we need to set out what that vision could be. Secondly, it does need to attract investment. So people talked about the Great North Plan being something of a prospectus, identifying the real economic, social and environmental opportunities, but presenting them in such a way that investors will have confidence and want to back those things. Thirdly, and I think this is the most kind of traditional view of what we understand to be a plan, is that it needs to facilitate and enhance collaboration, both vertically between sort of national and subnational players, but also horizontally around all those different stakeholders that are currently operating in the north of England, in order to, if you like, identify and then prioritise some real drivers of sustainable development in the north of England, that everybody can then rally and get behind. Again, I'll come back to this in a minute. And then lastly, it's got to galvanise action. There were people who came to the round tables that insisted that if it was going to have any merit at all, there has to be a clear action plan which holds different agencies accountable. What we can't do is just have a general document that everybody says, oh yes, that's lovely, but then nobody does anything about. So those are the 4 elements, the 4 purposes, as we're calling it, of a Great North Plan. Later on today, immediately after my presentation in fact, we want to give you an opportunity around your tables to discuss those purposes, those principles that I've just outlined. So we're going to come back to this slide, but those are 3 questions that you're going to get to discuss in a few minutes' time about the Great North Plan. Do you agree with these principles and purposes? If not, how would you change them? What would you prefer them to be like? And which of those purposes do you think have the highest priority in terms of the time that we need to give them or the resource that we need to give them, of those 4 things that we've talked about? So we'll come back to those in a minute. And you should have a copy of my presentation in your pack so you can refer back to that during the roundtable discussions. So just to dig down now a little bit and talk a bit more about those 4 purposes and what they might look like. First of all, the vision statement. People in the round tables have suggested it should run to about 2050. People have suggested that it should have 3 possible themes. So, for example, it should have an economic theme. How do we change the historical conception of the role of the North in terms of the national and the global economy? That might be the kind of vision that we set out. Lots of people talked about a vision around sustainability and resilience. How do we create good growth in the north of England? How do we drive environmental sustainability? So not necessarily the kind of economy that we see in London, perhaps a different kind of economy that we create in the north of England. And also people argued that there should be a theme around place. Every single place in the north of England, understanding its economic, social and environmental purpose, all of them playing their part in the way in which the northern economy might develop. And we should review it every 10 years. So those are some of the ideas that might be behind a vision. The next thing is around a prospectus. What should the prospectus look like? Well, we've all seen prospectuses, no doubt, regeneration master plans, whatever you want to call them, a glossy representation of that vision, but also the key elements, the key development drivers above. I understand that the Chancellor took 21 different proposals when he went out with the delegation to China recently to seek investment. Great. But how are they coordinated? How are they presented? What do they look like to a Chinese audience? I think that's what this prospectus might do. Some kind of visual master plan, a map for the North, which again we seem very reluctant in this country to actually set down. What does a map of the North actually look like? Reviewed and refreshed every couple of years, and probably developed with the involvement of marketing and inward investment people, so that we really galvanise all the skills that there are across the north of England. So that's the prospectus bit. Now, the crunchy bit, the bit about enhancing collaboration, the traditional plan, if you like, needs to be built upon the fantastic work that's going on at the moment with Transport for the North and the Northern Transport Strategy. Lots and lots of time and energy going into that transport plan, and I'm looking forward to seeing exactly what it proposes when it comes out late February, early March. But what we think is that transport plan is not enough. That doesn't constitute a Great North Plan. There needs to be a series of plans or layered maps, if you like, around some of the high-level drivers of growth and development. So a connectivity and transport plan, yes, including passenger freight, digital and so on. We're going to get that already. But what about economic growth opportunities? Where our innovation hubs are, where our sector strengths are, how our supply chains are distributed, where our infrastructure sites might be. We're going to get, in the next few weeks, the Northern Independent Economic Review, which will be very, very helpful in setting out some of that. But how does that look spatially across the north of England? What about our green infrastructure? Could we have a map of our green infrastructure? Where are our energy assets? Where are we going to drive our energy from? What about our water? What about our waste systems? How do they stack up across the north of England? And then what's going to happen to population? Something that combined authorities, cities are often slightly reluctant to talk about. Exactly how population change is going to take place. Can we map that? Where are our growth hubs? Where are our cold spots? Perhaps this is a time for doing some scenario planning, and that will feed through into sort of ideas around housing and communities going forward. And then lastly, recreational assets. Tourism, culture, quality of life, fantastic national parks. How do they map onto these other things that we have? How does the whole picture work together? Do you think there should be other priorities? We'll come back to that later on. And then within this, can we do some scenario planning? Can we set out indicative costs and benefits? Can we express all of this as a northern infrastructure plan, much like the national infrastructure plan that we have already, updated annually with clear priorities as we're setting out for transport at the moment? Just to be clear, what we shouldn't do with this plan, you've told us, is this shouldn't get into detailed land use planning. We should not be dictating from the Great North Plan exactly where homes should go and how that should work. That needs to be done at a tier lower down. Perhaps, too, we shouldn't be talking here about public services. We can't include everything within a Great North Plan. You can debate that later. So the discussion groups in the second session later on this afternoon will look at how do we cast a vision for the North. After transport, what are the greatest priorities? Are they energy, innovation? You tell us what you think they should be. And which issues should not be addressed in a Great North Plan? So you'll get to debate some of those things later. Finally then, getting on to action, delivery, governance. You have told us that you think that there needs to be some kind of 3-year rolling action plan associated with these other documents, setting out the key actions for a wide range of different stakeholders, and alongside those, having some kind of baseline measures, having some milestones for development. I have no doubt that we can put that kind of document together, something which holds, if you like, the whole process accountable. It could be overseen by a strategic planning group, you told us, perhaps with some element of democratic accountability and visibility. It's very interesting, I think, what's happened to what was once Rail North, which to some extent has now morphed into Transport for the North. And if we look at the model that Transport for London has adopted, it's Transport for London now has even wider powers and interests around economic development. I can quite see Transport for the North morphing into some kind of economic development body for the whole of the north of England. And then would that be the kind of structure that could hold and own and drive forward that plan? And where does democratic accountability fit into that? We know that there's a semi-democratic process around Transport for the North, but could that be enhanced and developed over time? Those are all questions that I think we need to debate. And do we need to hold an annual Northern Summit in order to evaluate the progress that we make with an action plan? So again, that's some thinking for us to do later on today. So where do we go from here? How do we take forward the Great North Plan? Well, you told us that there really needs some speed and momentum behind this process. It won't be achieved just in very, very small and organic steps. People need to get behind it. Some people said we'd read a target to get at least a couple of those interlinked documents sorted out by April 2017, so just over a year's time to pull a lot of this together. It needs to draw on some good examples, and we've already begun to look at some of the work that's being done in China, in the Netherlands, in Scotland, and I think later on Trudy Elliott from the RTPI is going to be, if you like, stimulating our imaginations about what can be done in this sphere from other countries. We need to look at different options as well as to how this process might take place over the next 12 to 18 months. Some people have suggested that in terms of the vision, we should organise a special competition where, if you like, some of us might set out the kind of broad parameters, but then it might be for developers, consultants, the general public, universities, who knows, to actually put forward their ideas as to what that vision might look like. And we might run it as a competition. It's just an idea. What do you think of that? But then in terms of the collaborative plan, clearly that can't be done necessarily through a competition. But that will require, I don't know, a technical group, a bit like we've got for Transport for the North at the moment, bringing together planners, universities, other stakeholders, local, central government, in order to really work through what our infrastructure priorities might be, exactly how our economic assets can be mobilised, and so on. So that might be a method of bringing together a collaborative plan. Some people suggested that we needed a commission, a Great North Plan commission of some kind, led by an influential northerner who could really drive through some of the process. So again, we'll discuss that a little bit. Underlying all of this, though, is who pays for it. How does it actually happen? And I hope you've brought your checkbooks with you this afternoon, because there's a real demand. If this is going to happen, yes, government can invest in it, but I think in the North we need to offer a degree of commitment ourselves as to how we put our own resources, whether they're human resources, financial resources, and so on, into actually making this happen. So that's something that we'll be debating and discussing later on. As Mark said earlier, for IPPR North and for the RTPI, the next step in this process comes in a couple of months' time. We'll gather up the discussions and the material that has been debated today, and we will pull together what we think is the best bet for getting a Great North Plan off the ground. That's providing you're still as positive by the end of the day as you are, as you have been at the beginning of the day. We'll pull that together into some kind of blueprint, which we intend to launch then in the spring. So once we've got that blueprint, I think the call will then be on partners, you round the table, working with combined authorities, working with the government to say, right, how do we take this then to its next step? Can we achieve that April 2017 goal of pulling together a Great North Plan? So in the spring, we'll set out, I hope, a blueprint as to how we get there. So I think that's pretty much all from me. Just to mention that the third round of discussion groups, later on, this will be the last session this afternoon, will give you an opportunity to discuss some of those things I presented just now. Should we take forward the plan? How should we do it? How fast do we need to move, and what resources do you think you could commit to this kind of process? So don't all leave before we get to that last question. So there you go, that's roughly what we're going to be doing today, and I'll stop there and hand back to Mark.